Hi folks, in this video we're going to look at statistics and how they come up in fake news. So of course, statistics can be very helpful. They often put very large abstract concepts and spreadsheets full of numbers, and it can help tell a story about lots of complex problems. They help us make decisions. They help analyze whether or not we should be insured or not through risk assessments. Um, they can help predict future events. A lot of statistics are used to create models on weather, hurricanes, climate change is modeling, and they look over past hundreds of years of data and to show if trends move a certain way, then a certain result will come. And they also help lead social change. Um, Often people don't really can grasp a problem, especially that is socioeconomic, because they're not in that situation. They don't have that perspective. But when you show them data telling a story, well, then it puts context to the problem. It shows it's the problem isn't anecdotal, or just a few people here and there talking about a problem. There really is a problem. um, Statistics are important for this reason, and it can help us make better decisions and choices on a whole wide variety of, of things. So let's take a look at this chart. Now, there's nothing really wrong with it, but is there anything that makes you skeptical about it? Is this really a good measure of how much time students spend studying? I'll give you a second just to mull it over. So a couple things wrong with it. Number of students, the students that are polled, it's less than 15. So that might be indicative of maybe one classroom of students, but to make a broad statement saying students need to spend more time studying, um, that you can't really judge anything by that. Do they even need to spend more time studying? All it is showing is that students spending time studying and the number of students that spend that amount of time. We don't know anything about the context of this story it's trying to tell. Is it just saying, is it for one particular class, or are they trying to prove a trend that students need to spend more time, or maybe they don't need to spend as much time studying? And then, this could be used further to manipulate data. I don't know the exact percentage, but you could say 90% of students are um, studying below 30 minutes. And then, what topic are they studying for? Is it for homework? Is it for an exam? Is it for college test? Is it the SATs? Um, you know, what grade level are they studying? Is this a college class? Is it elementary, middle school? So those are things that we would need to know and kind of look into this graph of information that is showing us this. Now, this video is going to give a really brief but very well pointed out example of how statistics can often be misleading, and then we can also go into how it could be used in context of fake news.
Statistics are persuasive, so much so that people, organizations, and whole countries base some of their most important decisions on organized data. But there's a problem with that. Any set of statistics might have something lurking inside it, something that can turn the results completely upside down. For example, Imagine you need to choose between two hospitals for an elderly relative's surgery. Out of each hospital's last 1,000 patients, 900 survived at Hospital A, while only 800 survived at Hospital B. So it looks like Hospital A is the better choice. But before you make your decision, remember that not all patients arrive at the hospital with the same level of health. And if we divide each hospital's last 1,000 patients into those who arrived in good health and those who arrived in poor health, the picture starts to look very different. Hospital A had only 100 patients who arrived in poor health, of which 30 survived. But Hospital B had 400, and they were able to save 210. So Hospital B is the better choice for patients who arrive at hospital in poor health, with a survival rate of 52.5%. And what if your relative's health is good when she arrives at the hospital? Strangely enough, Hospital B is still the better choice, with a survival rate of over 98%. So how can Hospital A have a better overall survival rate if Hospital B has better survival rates for patients in each of the two groups? What we've stumbled upon is a case of Simpson's paradox, where the same set of data can appear to show opposite trends depending on how it's grouped. This often occurs when aggregated data hides a conditional variable, sometimes known as a lurking variable, which is a hidden additional factor that significantly influences results. Here, the hidden factor is the relative proportion of patients who arrive in good or poor health. Simpson's paradox isn't just a hypothetical scenario. It pops up from time to time in the real world, sometimes in important contexts. One study in the UK appeared to show that smokers had a higher survival rate than non-smokers over a 20-year time period. That is, until dividing the participants by age group showed that the non-smokers were significantly older on average, and thus more likely to die during the trial period, precisely because they were living longer in general. Here, the age groups are the lurking variable and are vital to correctly interpret the data. In another example, an analysis of Florida's death penalty cases seemed to reveal no racial disparity in sentencing between black and white defendants convicted of murder. But dividing the cases by the race of the victim told a different story. In either situation, black defendants were more likely to be sentenced to death. The slightly higher overall sentencing rate for white defendants was due to the fact that cases with white victims were more likely to elicit a death sentence than cases where the victim was black, and most murders occurred between people of the same race. So how do we avoid falling for the paradox? Unfortunately, there is no one-size-fits-all answer. Data can be grouped and divided in any number of ways, and overall numbers may sometimes give a more accurate picture than data divided into misleading or arbitrary categories. All we can do is carefully study the actual situations the statistics describe and consider whether lurking variables may be present. Otherwise, we leave ourselves vulnerable to those who would use data to manipulate others and promote their own agendas.
So from that video, we can really see how statistics can be used to mislead us. And sometimes people take a legitimate study that will prove a point and be able to twist the the results to show information that doesn't exist there. So that's why we have to kind of be careful when we're looking at statistics and studying, surveys that are conducted or, different scientific studies. It's important to look into who are they studying, what age groups, what, how many people, what is their beginning and or ending. In the case of the hospital, more people were healthier going into one hospital versus another. So it may appear that one hospital has a better survival rate when when you really look into the numbers, that's not really the case either. So I don't want you to think that you can't trust studies, you can't trust data that is presented to you, but it's important to also look at it with a critical eye and consider a few things before, buying into it wholeheartedly. Now, the next couple of videos are produced by a data scientist from the University of Washington, and they went viral a few years ago for this course, and it's because it has a unique title, Calling Bullshit. But what's really great about these professors is they teach a concept that's kind of dry, kind of boring, and it's hard to talk about numbers and their meaning and why they can or cannot be trusted. And they do this in a really concise and well documented way. So I'm going to show you a couple of their videos, just so you can get a better idea on other elements of data that are important to look at and to consider when viewing resources.
Perfectly honest, when we released the site on January 11th, we thought maybe a couple of our friends would think it was kind of cool. We would have never thought, after we woke up the next morning with tens of thousands of hits from all over the world just in that first day. And since then, we've had massive, explosive growth in our users. You can see this just in tracking over the last few days. We've been getting hits from all over the world. You can see this was just in the first week or so. We had visitors from all over the world. The only places that we haven't got, if anyone knows anyone in Uzbekistan or maybe North Korea, we haven't got anything from North Korea yet. But the one that Carl and I really, really want is Greenland. So we'll be willing to give extra credit for anyone to fly to Greenland or set up a proxy somehow. That would be great. So yes, we're the elephants in the room, we're gonna brag a little bit here. It has been in the news. And really what this says is that it is resonating with people, I think. We're not the only ones that see that there needs to be some calling of bullshit. You guys see that. That's why you signed up. That's why, we depend on you. You're the generation that's gonna take care of me when I get older. So please, I want you to get good at this. And this sort of the news has been, we've been on news, which is, Carl and I have never really had this, so this is sort of starstruck kind of effect. But also, I just want to mention that King 5 will be here next week in this class, so if you don't want to be on camera, sit in the back. And Fox News will be here. You may get asked to interview. You don't have to interview. None of your grade won't be effective if you call bullshit on us and say that was the stupidest class I ever took. Don't worry. Just know that there will be media here. We've been, meeting with the Chronicle.
Hang on, Devin. Hang on a second. Give me the mic. Give me the mic. Sorry. I'm a little bit suspicious about what we just saw. Let me get this mic up so people can hear me. I'm a little bit suspicious about what we just saw. Look what Jevin just showed you guys. Anyone see anything wrong with that? Yeah. Yeah, right, look at that. It's starting at 100,000. That's a little bit fishy. It sort of makes you wonder, well, what's going on here, right? And I think that's kind of the least of the problems. Look how he's titling this. He says, this is explosive growth at callingbullshit.org. Now, what is this showing? It's showing it's going up, right? But explosive growth? Well, I don't know. So what are we measuring here? This is total unique visitors. What do we expect to happen to total unique visitors? It's not going to go down. There's no way for it to go down. So of course it's going up. Is this explosive growth? Right? So I don't know. And besides, this is kind of a famous form of graphical bullshit. This one was graphical bullshit that Tim Cook tried to pull when he tried to fill Steve Jobs' far too large shoes. He steps in at the CEO of Apple, and people stop buying, or at least iPhone sales flatten and then actually start to decline. And he steps up in 2014 in front of his shareholders, and he says, look, cumulative iPhone sales are exploding, right? Well, what are cumulative iPhone sales actually doing, well, they're going up, they don't go down. That's true of many cumulative things. But look at this graph. Here's another way to visualize the same data. Here's total sales, that's what he showed. Here's quarterly sales. Apple's in a slide after he took over. He's tried to hide it by graphing it like that. Does it look familiar? So, a couple of things going on here. I mean, first of all, Jevin didn't want you to see that our biggest growth was at the start. And we've been just kind of, moving along okay since then. But we went viral at the start. That's what the internet does to you occasionally. And so that's what happened. But if we look at our daily users, right, daily number of users, here's what we see over time, or kind of blowing that up so you can see it a little better. Here's a picture of what's going on for our daily users. Now, would you call that explosive growth if I showed you that? I would call that a lot of people cared and then they didn't, and then just when it seemed like they didn't, they did a bit, and then they didn't, and then they did a bit, and then they didn't, and then maybe a bit. And we seem to be having a good run here. And each of these, of course, correspond to news stories and so forth that have been published. So what Jevin just gave you there was really a piece of what I'd call new school bullshit. And he's trying to pull something over on you using fancy graphs. Everyone knows graphs have hard numbers behind them, so we should believe them, right? No. So to kind of bring this out, I want to just highlight the difference between old school bullshit and new school bullshit. So old school bullshit, and this is sort of not what the course is about, but we're all kind of used to this. People try to use fancy words in order to impress you or make you think, make you believe them, right? Or at least make you think that they must be doing something impressive. So, our collective mission is to functionalize customer-driven enterprise solutions for leveraging underutilized portfolio transparencies. That's old. I mean, anyone have any idea what that means? No idea what that means. That's old school bullshit. We exist as transmissions. To embark on the myth is to become one with it. That's old school new age bullshit. My goal, in essence, is to juxtapose musical semitones. Working binarily means that my focus is always percussively based and never orchestral. That's that's created actually by a computer program that generates musical artist bullshit. Whoops. And, this one's kind of just as our forefathers before us, we look to the unending horizons of our great nation with our minds fixed and our hearts aflame to rekindle the dampened sparks of our collective destiny, right? It's a little bit eloquent for current happenings in Washington, but you get the sort of general drift of that. So that's old school bullshit, and we more or less know how to see through that stuff, I think. But the problem is more and more we're getting bullshitted with numbers, with facts, with figures, with algorithms, with big data, right? And so more and more we're seeing things like this. Adjusted for international exchange rate, our top performing global fund beat the market in 7 of the 9 past years. Is it the same fund each of those 7, 9, or did they have some fund that beat the market, for example? What does adjusted mean? Well, short of statistical significance after Bonferroni correction, this underscores the results underscore a clinically important effect size, relative odds of survival at 5 years, 1.2, that challenges the current therapeutic paradigm. What does it mean for something to be clinically important if it's not statistically significant, for example? Interesting question. The team's convolutional neural net extracts the underlying control logic from a multiplex network composed of the human metabolome, transcriptome, and proteome. These 3 letters are a very good clue that you're listening to bullshit. 34% of behaviorally challenged second graders admit to having sniffed magic markers at least once in the past year. I made that up, but it's probably bullshit, even if it's true, because what fraction of non-challenged second graders sniffed magic markers? 53%? We don't know. I did. I guess you know that. All right, I'm going to turn this over to you, Jevin.
So from that video, we can see that it's important to kind of look at what charts and graphs are really telling us about a story. And, you know, it's easy to fall for a chart that, you know, shows a steep curve that shows increasing numbers. I'll have to admit, sometimes I fall for those charts initially without really, but on the first glance of it, because you know it's impressive. It looks, but then like the second professor who interrupts the initial lecture, of course it's going to grow because it can't go down at all. So, and that, you know, that doesn't make anybody, you know, uh, less intelligent for falling for, you know, that type of data trap that often gets set. But it just, it's important that that's an area that anybody can really, you know, have a false sense of being impressed by the growth of something or the sales of something. So in this next video, we're going to look at how they explain pretty charts and graphs and data visualizations. There's lots and lots of different software programs and ways that you can make data look a lot easier to understand, which are fabulous. And there's, you know, a lot of them really help paint a picture of, you know, large numbers of large numbers of numbers. You can see this a lot in elections within the United States, particularly because we have so many states with so many different elections. So it's really helpful when you see a beautiful map that if you hover over a state, it can turn how many voted one way and how many voted another. And then even going on a granular level, going to different counties and seeing who, you know, which candidates won and didn't. And that makes it a lot easier to follow that type of information. Whereas reading it, you know, 50% of Georgians voted one way, 50% of Georgians voted another way, or half of the country voted this way, half of the country voted that way. You know, what, that doesn't mean anything to people oftentimes. But when you see it in a beautiful, easy to read chart or map or diagram, it makes more sense. So in this video, they're going to go over how these charts can often be used in to mislead people further by stuffing them into contexts that they're not intended for. And they use the analogy of Cinderella's glass slippers.
There's another kind of bullshit that's closely related that I think, you know, deserves its own term. And this is what I've dubbed glass slippers. So if you guys remember the fairy tale Cinderella, in Cinderella, there's this glass slipper that fits on Cinderella, and the prince wants to find Cinderella, and so he's going to marry whoever can fit her foot into this glass slipper. So he goes around and he goes to the two evil, or he sends people to the two evil stepsisters, and the evil stepsisters, not in the Disney version, but in the real version of the fairy tale, the two evil stepsisters actually mutilate their feet. They cut off their toes, they cut off their heels, and try to jam their bloody feet into this glass slipper. The plan fails because it's made of glass. I don't think that's in the original, but it is certainly a problem. And they're not able to marry the prince, and then eventually everything ends happy, if I remember right. This can happen with data visualization as well. There are some really beautiful structures for visualizing very specific types of information, such as these. But they can be misused. People can try to shoehorn other kinds of data into those structures. So we have a periodic table, Dmitry Mendeleev's beautiful design that sort of manages to integrate a large number of facts surrounding the nature of chemical elements and their interactions with one another and their structure. We've got subway maps that are sort of beautiful examples of data design that highlight and simplify the important information that they want to convey. We have Venn diagrams that have this very technical representation where you've got, if you have A, B, C, D, E, then each of these overlaps corresponds to an overlap of certain segments. And then, since this is a biology class, I'm going to throw in a phylogeny. These are beautiful data visualizations that help us understand the relationships, the evolutionary relationships among species. The problem comes that these are so beautiful and they're kind of cool, and designers want to be kind of clever, and so they take data that have nothing to do with these underlying structures and they try to shoehorn it in to these structures, and it just plain doesn't fit, and you get bullshit. This is what I call a glass slipper. So let me give you an example. Here's the periodic table of data science. And a periodic table, there's a periodic table of everything, because everyone tries to put these things together. I don't understand it because none of the fundamental relationships that are there in the periodic table are reflected here. If we zoom in, we've got different categories. We've got courses and boot camps and conferences, and we represent everything by 2 letters because that's what you do in the periodic table. And it's just pure garbage. It's just sort of a list that's been assembled in some kind of nonsense fashion. There's no rhyme or reason to the fit of these data to a periodic table. It's a glass slipper. Subway maps. Everyone loves subway maps. So here's a subway map of Microsoft's acquisitions and investments. And so we can zoom in again and we see, I guess the lines correspond to different technology domains or something like that. I'm not sure whether they're ordered in any sequence whatsoever. I suppose if something lands in 2 technology domains, that's one of these places where 2 stops merge. But ultimately, a subway map, what's beautiful about a subway map is that the layout on the map represents a layout in physical space of the city. And there's no parallel physical space here. Even if these threads are in some way consistent, and it actually makes sense to sort things that way, even if these overlaps are real, even if these are ordered in some meaningful way, we still don't have data that should be arranged as a subway map. What does that curve mean? It doesn't correspond to anything. What's this river? It's a glass slipper. This one's amazing. This is the internet marketing tree. This is a bifurcating tree like a phylogeny. Looks like an unrooted phylogeny for the biologists here. It's not at all clear what this thing means. So look at this. Here's strategy. And strategy's nearest relatives, the clade of convert and multiply, and the clade of engage and attract. Now, it's interesting that those are kind of more related to strategy than to branding, and that multiply is more related to convert than engage is to attract. And in fact, convert and multiply are more closely related to strategy than engage and attract are related to strategy. I wouldn't have known any of that. And the reason I wouldn't have known it is because it's bullshit. Somebody just made it up. This structure doesn't match the data. They've shoehorned a bunch of words that they like onto an elegant data structure, and they end up with a glass slipper. Venn diagrams deserve their own category all to themselves. So let's look at this. This is some kind of business diagram, and we've got some important things: product excellence, effective branding, and promotional focus, and at their intersection, industry leadership and revenue growth and demand generation. When it all comes together, profit. Okay, so that sounds nice. I like it. But let's look at this. So why is revenue generation include promotional focus and product excellence, but is independent of effective branding? And why does demand generation have to do with effective branding and promotional focus, but nothing to do with product excellence? And why is profit a different category than all the other things that we're displaying up here? This is bullshit. This is just data bullshit being put together. They're taking a form that means something, and they're putting data into that form without respecting that meaning. Here's another one. This is the spectrum of user experience, and it's very pretty, and there's lots of nice words on it like business analytics and visual design development and prototyping, and we can zoom in and we see user experience at the center and style guide and information design, and you try to figure out how it all fits together, and there seems to be no rhyme or reason to any of the arrangements, let alone to the meanings of these overlaps. Another glass slipper. At the start of the class, I talked about how bullshit sort of reaches its apogee in the political sphere. Certainly true with Venn diagrams. They get used for just absolute garbage. This is something that that Mitt Romney put together, or Mitt Romney's campaign put together. And he says, as a candidate, this is middle class promise gap unemployment. As a candidate, Barack Obama promised that they were going to lower the unemployment rate. Then there's this result over here, which is the current unemployment rate, which is higher than what they were going to lower it to. And then there's this gap here of 8.4 million fewer jobs. But these bear no relationship to a pair of overlapping things. These are just three claims that have been pasted into the is it Visa? What logo? MasterCard logo. These are three claims that have been pasted into the MasterCard logo in order to make them look kind of data-y, graphic-y, trustworthy, right? A duck. Now, I don't want you to think I'm picking on the right. Here's Hillary. Hillary tweeted this out earlier last year. And so she's trying to make the point that, hey, look, most Americans support background checks, and so we should get on it and have background checks for guns. And so she puts out a nice Venn diagram, and she says, look, here's 90% of Americans, here's 83% of gun owners, and then somehow their intersection is supports universal background checks, which makes no sense. And then I'd like to know if the majority of these 83% of gun owners aren't Americans because they're not in that. Another duck, another disaster. And I'll finish with this one. I really have enjoyed collaborating with Thomson Reuters over the years, but either their graphic designer doesn't understand how Venn diagrams work, or this person was having a bit too honest of a day.
So in this last video that we're going to go over from the University of Washington, we're going to talk a little bit about statistics and journals. And this is because you're going to be looking at a lot of journal articles throughout your time at CSU or any university. So there's been the trend has been more prevalent in the last 20, 30 years, but really this has been going on for probably centuries. If you really think about it, and that's predatory publishing, and that the predatory publishing are publishers of journal, and I use air quotes, journals that really have no peer review process. Anybody can publish to them, and they can really appear quite professional and like trustworthy sources of information. There's a trend within academia as a help for students to move towards open access resources and textbooks because it saves you money and it's easier to obtain them. You can find them easily online, and it reduces student costs. But what also happens with a lot of the open access resources aren't the only place you'll find predatory journals. There's lots of junk journals that end up in appearing in search engines, databases, and we as librarians at the library do our best to make sure that the journals that we are providing students and faculty are trustworthy, peer-reviewed journals. But even the most peer-reviewed, respected journals have had incidences where they've published junk science, and they weren't an open access journal. With journals, a lot of the authors are hoping that eventually that they're when they read the journal, that the content in that journal has been peer reviewed. And a lot of times it is, but a lot of times it's not. It's just there's just so many submissions that it's hard to replicate. And this is more prevalent in the hard sciences like biology, chemistry, medicine, where it's hard to replicate quickly somebody else's research and work. So often predatory publishers will come around and, find, and they'll discuss this more in the video. Um, you know, Faculty often have to publish in order to get tenure, in order to get promoted. So they submit to these publishers, sometimes not even realize that they're predatory publishers. They'll pay exorbitant publishing fees to get their content published. So they have something that they can show their chair, their boss, their whoever, that they've published. And publishing is a big thing in a lot of universities. They rely, to even get hired, you have to be published somewhere. So these predatory journals have really sprung up with the turn to open access resources. But the problem is sometimes those open access resources aren't vetted. Credibility is often difficult to navigate. So it's easy for information, fake news, pseudosciences to get through, especially when they have a very thin veil of peer review. So that's where also a lot of misleading statistics can come from, and where you get people on social media pulling a journal article, and turns out it's from if you dig a little deeper, it's from a journal that really has no credibility to it. So let's watch this final video, and we'll talk a little bit about it afterward.
This is a term, predatory publishing is a term that's getting used often to identify these journals and papers that are really not producing good science. In fact, you could go so far as to say it's pseudoscience, fake science. And predatory publishing is not fully, but let's say partly a result of this movement into open access. So you're hearing a story now. We've been publishing for hundreds of years in the subscription-based journal system. We talked last week about issues within the papers themselves that get packed with publication bias. But now we're talking about the packaging itself is really starting to change in this digital environment. And when we need to go to the source, now you're telling me that there's going to be these predators. Predators have a negative connotation, as you can imagine, so you should probably be avoiding these, right? Well, let me just tell you a little bit about the publishing life cycle. Again, scientists will slave over things for years and years. They'll do anything to get into these, almost anything. They'll give a thumb, actually, to get into these journals. And they hope that people care and read about them. Just like a lot of what goes on in the social media, you build some creative video that you hope goes on YouTube and goes viral because you think it's cool and it's good to see people care about what you're doing. With science, though, we depend. It depends critically on something we call peer review. When that article goes to that journal, we hope that there are other scientists that are qualified that will help filter and remove those articles that are not legitimate, that are wrong, that have conclusions that don't match up with the way that the results came out and the design was set up. So you would hope that there would be some articles that get through peer review that are just thrown in the garbage. But here's the sad thing. Almost none of it goes into the garbage. Eventually, there have been studies that have shown that eventually, doesn't matter how silly the article is, they land in some venue. Now that, in Carl and I's perfect world, we'd like to see more in the trash. But what usually happens, and at least this is somewhat a positive side of what's going on here, at least with peer review, they'll iterate with the author and say, you need to remove this aspect of the paper, you need to add this aspect. So in that case, at least that's going on. But we do depend on this intimately. Now that's the normal publishing life cycle. Here's the predatory publishing life cycle. We spent a lot working on these articles. We want to get to the journals, right? We want our deans to give us raises. All we have to do is, basically send money to these predatory journals. And a lot of these predatory journals, what do you see missing here between this picture and this picture? Basically no peer review, definitely no trash, And most of the time, sadly, no one cares. No one cares. This is like, this is typically, actually, this would probably be a good case scenario for some of the stuff that gets through here because there's no peer review. I'm actually glad that most people don't read it. But things that are on contentious issues around climate change, around vaccines, et cetera, they do land and they do get read by many, but they typically don't have the same kind of peer review. Now, there are many publishers in this area, some legitimate, some non-legitimate. The point is they're growing dramatically. Open access journals. I'm not necessarily saying just predatory journals, but some questionable journals are popping up when you have hundreds and hundreds of journals being added all the time. And why would you add a new journal? Because there's money to be made. So we've been also working, this is a sub-project of what we're doing with the Eigenfactor, trying to identify metrics for deciphering these kinds of journals. The big thing here is that this was a graph. By the way, does anyone recognize what kind of graphic is this? All right, you guys are good. This is a duck, but it's an effective duck, I guess. This particular duck, actually, this shark fin does a reasonably good job of basically just showing that there is growth in these predatory publishers over time, both in the even hijacked journals that get hijacked by individuals, and they bring in the money, they're hosting the website, and the whole point is that they're growing. So why would anyone want to publish in a predatory journal if they knew that they know that it was predatory?
There's a few reasons why people might choose to publish in a predatory journal. One is just simply their own naivete. It's not always that easy to tell whether a journal is predatory or not. And these predatory journals come looking for you, which we'll talk about a bit more. They send you emails and ask you to submit articles, and they say, oh, we read your paper such, and we're really impressed, and would you give us an article? And that can be really flattering. And one of the harder conversations I've had to have with an undergraduate here was to explain that the invitation she had received to submit an article like this was actually just spam and not that somebody had actually been very impressed by some work we'd done together. So that's one thing, is that people who aren't used to the game are fairly easily, or can be taken in this way. Some of the major funders have told me that, especially in developing countries, some of the people they fund get taken in this way, and so on. So that's certainly a possibility. But I think a really big one that we've got to admit and think about is that authors are publishing in these journals because of other people's naivete. So one reason is they just want to fool their dean, because perhaps their dean isn't really reading the papers or even looking carefully at where the papers are published. They're just counting up papers to see, is this person publishing or not. And so what's happened in science is that these bibliometrics, ways of quantifying scientific output, have become a really, really big deal. They often are formulaic determinations of whether you get raises, whether you get tenure, all these things that academics are pursuing. And once academics start, once people start using those measures start to lose their effectiveness. So Campbell's law, this is a really important notion. Campbell's law says the more any quantitative social indicator is used for social decision making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social process it's intending to monitor. So kind of one way to phrase it. We often hear this expressed as Goodhart's law. Goodhart says any observed statistical regularity will tend to collapse once pressure is placed upon it for control purposes. And those are both kind of complicated ways to say something pretty simple. This is the TLDR version of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So once, the number of publications that you produce becomes a target on which you're evaluated, it's no longer a good measure of your quality, because people will find ways to game that system, right? And so that, I think, is a big part of what's going on here. This, I hope, in a few years will be known as Jevons law. And this is a close corollary. Jevons says, when talking about these metrics, giving bad answers is not the worst thing a ranking system can do. The worst thing is to encourage bad science. So you can do worse than actually getting it wrong. You can create incentives for people to behave poorly and do bad science with these kinds of quantitative evaluation systems. And I think part of the reason people publish in these predatory journals is if I wanted to publish 10 papers next month, it'd be easy to do. Just put together 10 anything and send it to those journals along with some money. And you can just do that. The other reason that people want to do it involving others' naivete is that I think there are sometimes efforts to fool an audience, to convince an audience that something is more scientific than it seems. And this is sort of a central theme of this lecture, is that a lot of the stuff that looks like science but is published in these allegedly predatory journals may be unreputable. It may not be carried out to this kind of standards and, that you'd expect of scientific work. So, you know, it turns out to be very, very useful to crackpots and to denialists of various stripes and purveyors of alternative science and alternative medicine and pseudoscience and so on and so on. And I'll just give you some examples of the sort of thing one might see. Here's a paper in one of the omics group. They're a big, one of these questionable publishers. And it's called The Subversion of Medicine and Public Health by International Security Prerogatives. And it's sort of a whole New World Order story. Under the cover of reproductive health, involuntary sterilizations are implemented through the developing world through adulterated vaccines. But when the developed world, flu immunization programs weaken the immune systems of the old and civil servants to shorten lifespans and spare governments from meeting insolvent healthcare and pension plan obligations in the last stage of the demographic transition. So there you go. You can look that one up. And here's another one. This is basic principles underlying human physiology. This is an HIV denialist page. HIV is not ideologically involved in AIDS. It's just a common retrovirus found in AIDS conjuncturally. Actually, heart failure represents the causal factor of AIDS and many other primary immune deficiencies. And if you look at the paper, there's not good evidence for this, of course. And this sort of thing would never get published in a reputable source, but it'll be published in a journal that it takes the money and doesn't do peer review. And here is the Trivedi effect. What is the Trivedi effect, you might be asking? Well, what is the Trivedi effect? The Trivedi effect is a scientifically proven phenomenon. Everyone and everything in the universe springs from the energy of creation, born of a divine source. This energy is the life force that connects us to each other, to ourselves, and to creation itself. It's intelligent and powerful, far beyond what the imagination can comprehend. So it's scientifically proven. Well, where? Well, here's one place. This is an experiment. First author is Trivedi himself. And in this experiment, this sort of biofield is able to manipulate the physical properties of magnesium powder. And so there are a number of these papers that Trivedi has published in various publishers which have been described as questionable. Though you should read them for yourselves. And if you're enthusiastic, the good news is that for only $250, Mahendra Trivedi would be willing to do a one-time intercession, performing a single targeted energy transmission to you.
So now what? How do we decipher what studies and statistics we can trust and which can't we? Well, all hope is not lost. It just means that you need to dig a little deeper sometimes when you're doing research. Laterally fact check, which we'll go over a little bit later in the course on how to do it. Look at the credibility of the source. Yes, well reputable journals, they're going to make mistakes just like any other human-run organization. When you're looking at a study, make sure you pay attention to the sample size and the method that they collected their data, and see if there's anything that makes you suspicious about the conclusions they're coming to with their data. Often, at the end of a journal article, the author will have reflections on their study and point out things that their study does or doesn't reflect. So why that's important is because when somebody is being transparent on, the shortfalls of their work, they're probably trying to be as open and honest about their about the information they're presenting to you as they can be. Look for replications of the study. There's lots and lots of content and information and medical research that comes out daily. have, if somebody finds something that's really groundbreaking and eye-opening, are other scientists finding this? Is there any conflicting information that makes you want to go, I'm not too sure about that? Um, Looking at the authors of it, is there any motivation? Is this is the person publishing, trying to get a dissertation out? Um, are they, looking to be published so their tenure? And that's not saying anybody who is looking for those things are, putting out junk information. But if you're doubting an article and you've gone through a checklist of things that might raise red flags on if you should look a little further on this topic, that might be something that would cue you in that says, you know what, I better look at other things. And just use good old common sense. You know, there are scientists that come out with groundbreaking information like Dr. Semmelweis, who, washing your hands, prevented spread of disease. At the time, that was groundbreaking. And people thought he was a fool and, that they couldn't possibly be spreading germs on their, pious hands. But now we know a little bit more about, and the average person knows a lot more on basic scientific things and elements that come out. So if something sounds pretty outlandish, you know, don't necessarily dismiss it right away, but don't accept it as, absolute truth either. Um, use your good old common sense. And if something seems a little off, or you're not exactly sure that this source can be trusted, dig a little deeper and you might find that you can. And it's at the journal or whatever data set you're looking at is perfectly fine. And it is an accurate picture of what's being displayed. And you'll hear that phrase, statistics, numbers don't lie. And that's true, numbers don't lie, but the people who enter them do. So often, if data is off, it's completely unintentional. However, sometimes it is. And that's where statistics and data can really create some awful fake news and make, send out a lot of horrible misinformation that has an impact on people's lives. And in this module, we'll go over a few examples of how misinformation really has, impacted huge groups of people after publishing, this groundbreaking information. So if you have any questions, we'll end on statistics right here. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. There's some other things in the module I want you to look at related to statistics, and let me know if you need me to clarify anything. Have a great day. Bye-bye.